I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. Today we're going to talk about China's policy toward Tibet. Since 1951, when Tibet was formally annexed into the People's Republic of China, Tibet has been a battleground between China's efforts to assert control and the Tibetan people's struggle to preserve their culture and religious identity. This past August, China's leader Xi Jinping made a surprise visit to Tibet, his second since becoming China's top leader in 2012. Less than 2 months earlier, the Dalai Lama, now 90 years old, announced that his office, not China, would choose his successor when he passes. A few months before that, the Dalai Lama revealed in a memoir that he would reincarnate outside of China. The PRC insists that the next incarnation, the 15th Dalai Lama, will be born inside PRC territory and approved by the Chinese government. What are Beijing's interests in Tibet, and how has Xi Jinping pursued those interests since coming to power? What's likely to occur after the Dalai Lama's passing? I'm delighted to have as my guest today Tendor Dorjee. Tendor is an adjunct assistant professor of political science at Columbia University. He's also a senior researcher at the Tibet Action Institute and the inaugural Stephanie G Neuman Fellow at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. And Tendor recently co-authored a very excellent article in Foreign Affairs, which is titled Beijing's Dangerous Game in Tibet. And I would certainly commend that article to all of you. So thank you so much for joining us, Tendor.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Pleasure to be here.
Well, maybe you can start by telling us briefly why is Beijing so determined to exert total control over Tibet? What are its key interests there?
I would say, to simplify the story, I think there are three key interests for the Chinese government when it comes to Tibet. I think one is strategic, another is colonial, and the third is psychological. From a strategic perspective, the Tibetan Plateau, combined with the Himalayas, can be actually seen as a kind of great wall that actually works in defending and repelling enemies. Tibet has long been a buffer state between India and China for most of history until its invasion in 1951. So in that sense, for China, the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas serve a very, very strong natural defense system on its southwestern border. Another reason is colonial. Tibet has been a place where a kind of a periphery where the Chinese government has extracted a great deal of resources, whether it's water resources, timber, or mineral resources. So it serves this kind of colonial economic exploitation purpose. The third reason is, I would say, psychological in a sense, because even though the conquest of Tibet as a land was relatively quick, it took the Chinese government a very long time to subdue the Tibetan people who fought a valiant war against the invasion. And even to this day, the Tibetan people remain a very, very strong kind of challenge to China's consolidation of authority over its empire.
How would you describe Xi Jinping's approach to Tibet? Are there any notable changes from his predecessors, Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin, and what are the drivers of his policy, both domestic and external?
From the perspective of the Tibetan people, it would be very difficult to say that there is any Chinese leader that the Tibetans miss, even among Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, or Deng Xiaoping. And even by those abysmal standards, what Xi Jinping has done, in spite of the fact that he came into office amidst such fanfare of media coverage, people expecting him to be some kind of a reformer, in spite of all that, the ironic thing is that Xi Jinping has probably been the one leader who has brought more hardline repressive policies into Tibet than any other leader over the last 40 years. And I would say, compared with the previous generation of Chinese policies on Tibet, Xi Jinping's approach, one major change has been, whereas in the past, the Chinese Communist Party kind of combined political repression with some degree or a semblance of cultural accommodation in Tibet, and also for the Uyghurs and for the Mongolians. When it comes to Xi Jinping era rule, what they have done is combined, basically it's political repression multiplied by cultural erasure. And the reason behind that, in a way, basically, in the past, to sum it up, in the past, if dissent was always punished in Tibet, right now it is not just dissent that's being punished, but difference that has been criminalized. And I think the guiding reason behind that is kind of a vision, a colonial vision that has started to see Tibet see any kind of cultural difference as a threat to the stability of the regime. So it is not what you do that threatens the regime, it is who you are that threatens the regime. And because of that, from Xi Jinping's perspective, the only path to political stability, permanent political stability for China, is cultural uniformity and the attempt to enforce and impose cultural uniformity on everyone under Chinese rule. That is responsible for the current hardline policies, I would say.
So the primary drivers are internal. Are there any external drivers of this policy?
I would probably say it's a combination of both internal and external, because internally it's related to stability, and China has always seen its illegitimate rule over Tibet as a threat, because Tibetans are still resisting Chinese occupation. They are still opposed to Chinese rule, and every time there is an opportunity, Tibetans always succeed in showing it. So whether it's in 1987, 88, 89, or in 2008 through a nationwide uprising, there was always that sign of discontent and dissent and difference. So I think it's internal. At the same time, also from a global geopolitical perspective, China's control over Tibet and absolute domination over Tibet is actually very important, because if Tibet continues to remain a restive challenge to internal consolidation, China will find it very, very difficult to project power through the region in Asia and globally.
Xi Jinping's recent visit to Tibet was very heavily covered in the Chinese media. Not surprisingly, a lot of images and, of course, statements that he made. What struck you as most notable, significant from that visit? What were the messages that he was trying to convey? And does that tell us anything about how he will handle Tibet in the coming years? And obviously, Xi Jinping will be entering into his fourth term in 2027. Do you think he has any particular ambition that he wants to achieve as his legacy in Tibet?
I think one of the observations, basically, that came to us when Xi Jinping recently visited Tibet. There were a lot of discussion globally and also internally in Tibet. There were people sharing images on social media in a very veiled, cryptic kind of way. And I think, those things were interesting, because Tibetans on some social media were sharing images of the night when Xi Jinping came to Tibet. At night, basically around midnight, fireworks go off to basically celebrate the milestone and the occasion and what China is trying to showcase in Tibet of its successes. But the Tibetans who were sharing images, they were not sharing about the celebration. They were not sharing news of Xi Jinping. What they were sharing is actually exactly at the moment when the fireworks went off, apparently there were lightning from the sky. There was a thunderstorm, in the sky. And some of those videos and photos captured exactly that moment when the fireworks were going up and lightning was coming down from the sky, kind of showing the clash between reality and propaganda, or the clash between Chinese government's designs for Tibet, Xi Jinping's design and vision for Tibet, versus what the Tibetan people, or even what nature really wants in Tibet. And I think that was such a interesting moment, because I think it also shows the contrast between the person of Xi Jinping and the person of the Dalai Lama. In Dharamsala, just a couple months earlier in July, what you have is the entire world, diplomats from various countries, artists, musicians from everywhere going to Dharamsala to see this refugee who doesn't have his own military, who doesn't have his own police force or anything, but people are going there voluntarily and willingly to celebrate his birthday. In Tibet, when Xi Jinping comes, you have to pay people and coerce people to celebrate and dance. So I think we often talk about an imbalance of power between Tibet and China, or Dharamsala in Beijing, but this was such a lesson in the imbalance, the asymmetric balance of legitimacy. When we talk about legitimacy, His Holiness and the Dharamsala has such a huge advantage over Beijing. I think that was interesting to see in those images.
There are obviously major infrastructure projects going on throughout China. Some of them, of course, in Tibet, like the Yarlung Tsangpo Dam and the Xinjiang-Tibet Railway. Do you see these as part of a broader strategy by Beijing to tighten control ahead of the Dalai Lama's passing, which we hope will not happen soon, but of course could happen anytime?
So I often, sometimes I know there was a debate in the discipline and in the field about whether China is an expansionist power or not, whether China is just a humble autocracy that is content with what it has and it won't seek to project power beyond its borders. But when I look at what China is doing around the Himalayas, with its borders with India, what it's doing on its other frontiers to Taiwan, South China Seas, especially when we look at the Himalayas and on the Indian side of the Himalayas, what China is doing, it's very clear that it has expansionist vision and it has a hegemonic ambition in the region. So there was this idea for centuries that whoever, and this is, the idea from the Great Game, when the Russians and the British were basically jostling for influence and hegemony in Asia, there's this idea that whoever controls Tibet, the Tibetan plateau, will dominate Asia. And right now, back then, this was just an idea. And right now, the Chinese government is really has turned this into a hypothesis, and it's actually acting on that hypothesis. So one of the great advantages of, controlling the Tibetan plateau is you automatically control the water tower of Asia. So the major rivers that come out of Tibet basically feed 1.5 billion people who live in Asia. And that is a really profoundly powerful control you have over the fate of downstream nations like India, Bangladesh, and many others. And the example of the Yarlung Tsangpo Dam in Arunachal, near Arunachal, is just the most recent clear example of Chinese government's designs on hegemonic control over Asia. And even with the dam, Chief Minister of Arunachal Pradesh, Pema Khandu, he recently said, they're really concerned about this particular dam because what could it mean for the downstream nations and communities? It becomes very, very easy to weaponize for the Chinese government so that it can displace people downstream in Arunachal. It can cause havoc for many communities, many villages, many cities. And in fact, Pema Khandu actually went on to say, this could become a kind of a water bomb in the hands of the Chinese dictatorship in the future. So it's a real concern. And Churchill said, history will be kind to me because I will write it myself. Chinese government, if if you want to, you can think, if you want to know about the past of a country, look at its history. But in the case of China, if you want to look at China's future, its future designs, look at its history also, because China writes its own history, and now it started calling Arunachal Pradesh Southern Tibet. So it's writing history before it actually happens.
So what are the various scenarios that could emerge after the Dalai Lama's passing? As I understand it, it certainly could take several years to identify the reincarnated Dalai Lama. It seems to me that Beijing is determined to appoint the next Dalai Lama, just as they installed the Panchen Lama in 1995. So if that's just one scenario, I'm curious whether you see others. But then I'd like to understand, what are the risks that this could create? How would Tibetans within Tibet and in exile respond if Beijing appoints a Dalai Lama before the reincarnated Dalai Lama is actually identified? And what is the potential for a real another uprising in Tibet and outside Tibet?
So one possible scenario is that if the Chinese government doesn't do anything to meddle in the Tibetan people's religious affairs, then there will be one Dalai Lama, a legitimate, real Dalai Lama who will be born in the free world. This could be anywhere outside of the Chinese government-controlled territories. If China becomes a free and democratic country, the Dalai Lama might be born in China too, right? But that's the price China has to pay. But another scenario, a more likely scenario, if the CCP is still around, and if China is still an authoritarian regime by the time His Holiness passes away, then we will very likely get a scenario where there will be a free and legitimate Dalai Lama, 15th Dalai Lama, in exile, recognized by the Tibetan people through the legitimate traditional system of recognizing reincarnation. And remember, Tibetans believe in rebirth. The Chinese government does not believe in rebirth. And at the same time, very likely the Chinese government will install its own Quisling Pope in Beijing. And here I want to be clear, we should remember there will be no two Dalai Lamas. I know, in the media recently, people have been saying there will be two Dalai Lamas. There will not be two Dalai Lamas. There will be one Dalai Lama in the free world. And there will be a challenge to that Dalai Lama by a puppet candidate from Beijing, right? And the current example we have is, so the one precedent we have is the case of the Panchen Lama in 1995 and 96. The real Panchen Lama, who was recognized by the Dalai Lama through the proper Buddhist Tibetan reincarnation method, was abducted by the Chinese government. And now we have the Chinese candidate, or the fake Panchen Lama, that Tibetans view him as the fake Panchen Lama, who is now in Beijing. And we can tell from this example that Tibetans widely and routinely and aggressively ignore him. Nobody accepts him as the real reincarnation. And the clearest example came out in 2023, when in July and August, there was a Kali Chakra by a highly respected Tibetan Lama called Gungtang Rinpoche in Labrang, in the Labrang region, northeastern Tibet. And the number of people who broke the law, who broke Chinese government rules or curfew or roadblocks in order to get to that Kali Chakra teaching. People are giving estimates from anywhere from 200,000 to 500,000 Tibetans gathering in the Labrang region for that 5-day Kali Chakra teaching. 2 months later, the Chinese Panchen Genzen Nobu came to Tibet and Shigatse and gave a teaching. Nobody wanted to go. people were dragging their feet because the government was forcing them to go. So it was using payment and punishment to get people to go. So the difference between those two teachings and the attendance at those two teachings is such a clear contrast and a clear prediction on how Tibetans in exile will reject the Chinese version, and how Tibetans in Tibet will just ignore the Chinese version of the 15th Dalai Lama.
Is there any risk of violence? I know some people are forecasting that there could be a sort of violent reaction to Beijing attempting to appoint a Dalai Lama. And of course, that could lead to a further crackdown on Tibetans. Is that something that you're concerned about?
If we look at the history of Tibetan mobilization, Tibetan mass mobilization, and also when mass mobilization tips over into violence and rage, the two major examples, 1959 and 1987. So 1959, you have a full-on uprising in Lhasa. And Tibetans, even though this was, 9 years after the signing of the 17th Point Agreement, 9 years after the Chinese Communist troops came to Tibet, Tibetan people rose up in 1959. And the immediate reason for that was there was a rumor that the Dalai Lama was about to be kidnapped by the Chinese military. And that rumor was enough to get everybody up in arms. Then, if we look at 1987, people poured out on the streets, and very soon those protests turned into situations where young Tibetans were toppling Chinese police cars, setting police stations on fire. And the reason, once again, for that, if we look back at history, it was around the time when the Dalai Lama was visiting the United States, when he gave a speech in the U.S. Congress. And the Chinese government condemned that speech, and they were basically broadcasting in Tibet about the visit of the Dalai Lama in the US, and they were condemning him and saying the worst possible things about him. And that basically provoked and triggered the Tibetans to once again come out in the street and do what they did. So if we look at the history of Tibetan mobilization, every single time the Chinese government attacks the Dalai Lama as a person or as an institution, those are the most volatile periods for eruption of sentiment, for eruption of unrest. And therefore, in the future, if the Chinese government meddles in the situation and basically continues to carry out its plan to attack the institution of the Dalai Lama, one difference between the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama is even though the Panchen Lama is also very highly respected as a leader, there is something that the Dalai Lama means to the Tibetan people. He is not just a leader who has worked hard all of his life and provides leadership. He is also a symbol of the nation. And there is something that's qualitatively different between the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama that goes much deeper into the Tibetan heart. And if we look at the Tibetan self-immolations from 2009 to 2022, more than 160 Tibetans who basically set themselves on fire in order to protest Chinese rule, many of the slogans, many of their last words basically talk about the Dalai Lama. So in that sense, what he means to the Tibetan people, the Chinese government doesn't seem to appreciate the depth and the seriousness of that situation. So I think there is a really huge risk of volatility. And in addition to that, the Dalai Lama has also been the number one factor that's preventing Tibetan radicalization up until now. And in a future, when he is no more, that constraint on Tibetan radicalization will also be gone. So I would say Beijing is playing with fire with this one.
Do you think that there are people in China who understand these risks?
I do think there are respected Chinese scholars who understand these things. I've been speaking with I've had the opportunity to meet a couple of them over the last several years. And they were also, we can go online and read some interviews with some of the highly respected Chinese scholars from Beijing, from Tsinghua University or the Party School, who have tried to warn the Chinese government, hey, be careful with this one. You're playing with fire. But the Chinese government under Xi Jinping's rule really has taken the opposite approach.
It's hard to know if or what is being communicated upwards to.
The think tanks in Beijing don't have the same influence over the regime as the think tanks in Washington.
Well, that's certainly true. I thought you were going to say they don't have the same impact as they used to have, and I think that's also
yes. That would also be true. Yeah.
So, what about the risks for neighboring states, and especially India, of the Dalai Lama's proclamation that he intends to reincarnate in the free world? And I've talked to some people in India about this, but how do you think that they see those risks, and will the government in exile in Dharamsala, will there be any changes, or are you confident that the relationship between the government, the Tibetan government in exile, the Dalai Lama potentially remaining in India, even a reincarnated Dalai Lama eventually, do you think that relationship will remain solid?
Yeah, I think among the neighboring states, especially India, where Tibetans have had such a long historical relationship with India that is spiritual, political, cultural, there is a tendency. So I would say over the last few years, the Indian government has been showing greater appreciation for these challenges that are to come, and also the opportunities that might come. But there are pockets in the Indian government who might still be viewing the situation of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama as a diplomatic hot potato. It's if a future Dalai Lama was born in India, it might create some kind of a diplomatic unease and continue to be this side irritant in the relationship between China and India. And that is there. That element is there for sure. But I think what separates great powers from small powers or middle powers is, while small and middle powers are focused on the risks and they are unable to see the opportunities, I think great powers can see the opportunities in addition to the risks. So they're not just completely obsessed with the risks of a situation. And with the Dalai Lama and the reincarnation of this institution, there was a huge opportunity for India also. And I think that should also be, front and center for the Indian government when it comes to global soft power. I think many Indians actually have told me that the Dalai Lama is one of the biggest generators of Indian soft power on the global stage, as somebody who is this, philosophical leader who basically Buddhism, aside from Bollywood, Buddhism is the other great Indian soft power export to the world. And right now, when the world goes to India, when the world wants to learn Buddhism, where do they go? They go to India. They don't go to all the other Buddhist countries in Asia. Very few go there. They all go to India. But in India, where do they go? They don't go to Rishikesh. They don't go to Banaras. They go to Dharamsala or Balakupi, because it's with the Tibetans that they can go and learn Buddhism, right? So the greatest ideological kind of philosophical soft power that India has, I think the Dalai Lama is basically the embodiment of that. And I think the Indian government has been pretty good at appreciating that. So that's one advantage. And in a future struggle between India and China for hegemony over Asia, that soft power will actually make a huge difference. Another is local legitimacy, not just global, but local legitimacy for the Indian government. Many of the regions on the Himalayan belt, these people who are ethnically Tibetan, religiously Buddhist, these people, their loyalty is not, their ultimate loyalty is not to any particular state, whether it's China or India, New Delhi or Beijing. Their ultimate loyalty is to the Dalai Lama as their spiritual guru. And right now, because the Dalai Lama is in India, all of these people in the Himalayan belt, that's one advantage for the Indian government by proxy. So I think in the future for the Indian government, if you can see it, there is a huge opportunity. And just the fact that right now the Dalai Lama in his book has announced that the future incarnation will be born outside of China, that alone is a cause for celebration from the Indian perspective, I would say.
We've been talking with Tendor Dorjee, who's an adjunct assistant professor of political science at Columbia University, and he also is affiliated with the Tibet Action Institute and the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. I want to thank you so much, Tendor, for joining us. It was such a great discussion, and I want to encourage our listeners and viewers to read your recent co-authored article, which is in Foreign Affairs, and it's titled, again, Beijing's Dangerous Game in Tibet. Thanks, Tendor.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.